I like what you just said, Lee, and I want you to tell me where you want to go with it.
Okay.
But maybe one of the things that, because you now talk about the relationship to philosophy, and art is different from philosophy, so I guess I'm kind of curious, what revealing false problems where that might take you? What it might actually involve in making artworks?
Well, I guess that depends on the false problem that's being addressed in particular.
Name one.
Name one? Death. Death is a false problem.
I'm glad to hear it.
Or yeah, you're welcome. Or the apprehension, let's say, that precedes it, and the grief that follows it. I suppose the nature of like what it means to look at that as a false problem is also to look at it. Also becomes sociology. It becomes political criticism. It becomes cultural criticism. It becomes explorations of visual culture, of religious theory, of all of these different ways, or these, let's say, a constellation of ways that we've already kind of tried to address that as a problem and have failed to do so because it's not really a problem. So I suppose in that respect it means bringing in examples of those kinds of, let's say, lines of semiotic inquiry that pre-exist the creation of the artwork, and to sort of like mine those existing vocabularies of how we talk about death, or how we address death, or how we frame death culturally or consciously, and using those, sort of mining those for the raw mineral, let's say, of what then gets reconstituted as an artwork. There's something in the role of the art, and I haven't totally framed this out yet, but there's something in the role of the artist about allowing things to be followed to their natural conclusions. So allowing a set of assumptions that we make to sort of play out in the intellectual, free space, playful atmosphere of the studio, let's say, and then subsequently the exhibition space. To sort of, what happens if we follow the assumption to its logical conclusion, how turned around or how kind of wrong-headed can that thing get?
A student I had many years ago, Leah Glushin, had a marvelous art statement which was exactly one sentence long. But in the statement, picking up on what you're talking about, Lee, she mentioned that her task as an artist was to look for absurdities and work to emphasize their charms. And I'm hearing you talk, perhaps in the same arena, about emphasizing the charms of false problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's quite lovely. I like that. Absurdity is curious. I mean, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about absurdity, but I do spend a lot of time thinking about comedy. And oh yeah, sorry, go on.
Well, before we get to comedy, which we'd love to get to, I want to pick up, while we're still talking about what's to be done as an artist, on because I think that we're now working towards a question of what would constitute the leitmotif or the core idea or ideas that filter through your work. Mm-hmm. And you've identified one which seemed to correlate with what you've just been discussing as the central problem of the terminus, which is, I guess, another word for death.
Sure. It's
always good to go to Latin when you're worried.
That's right. Especially when you don't actually want to be so specific as saying it's all about death. Right.
And of course, death comes in many guises, and of course, in nuances. And I guess this is the territory that you want to find your work within. And as to that, I'm kind of curious if you would like to talk about one or two particular works so that we have a grounded sense of what this question of the central problem of the terminus might actually involve when it comes to making artwork.
Sure. Let's.
I have a couple that I thought
Yeah.
might be interesting for you to address.
I was thinking about talking about the refinement pavilions.
Sure.
So the so I did a project, or it's kind of an ongoing project that I'm calling the refinement pavilions, and it's a series of urns. Each of the urns houses the ashes of a first edition of a first printing of a book whose author wanted that book destroyed, unread, and unpublished at the time of their own death. So Vladimir Nabokov, for instance, his book, The Original of Laura, Dying is Fun is the subtitle. He wanted that work destroyed because it was unfinished at the time of his death. And he said, destroy it, burn it, never publish it, it shouldn't see the light of day. And for decades afterwards, his son sort of hummed and hawed occasionally about whether he should publish this work. And every time he brought the idea up, it was met with consternation and controversy. And he did eventually publish it in 2009, I believe, 2009 or 2010. And the Nabokov scholars at the time were appalled that he would dare go against the great author's wishes, but they were also really happy because they had this new work to study, right? And a lot of them were saying like it would have been his best work had he been able to finish it. So that kind of ambivalence around heeding the wishes of the dead, or the ambivalence around what constitutes authorship and what the author gets to say about their work or not say about it, and what kind of agency they're given over the work after they've slipped the mortal coil. So in a way, I think we talk about artworks as outliving people. We talk about literary works as outliving people as a form of immortality, which I think is kind of ridiculous because it becomes its own entity that then gets fussed with and messed with, and it gets transmuted into a book when it was originally just note cards, or it gets transmuted into ashes when it was originally note cards, and then an illegal, let's say, book. So I became interested in that, about like sort of where does that end point actually sit in the decision-making process? How does Nabokov's influence over his work end when he dies, but then also simultaneously kind of find these other small points of ending as it goes along, as his wishes are heeded for 40 years and then eventually abandoned.
There's another work which I was thinking it would be interesting for you to talk to. The known effects of lightning on the body. Would you care to talk about that as well?
In relationship to that idea of the terminus?
Yeah, it's being discussed in that relationship.
Sure.
So,
yeah.
But if you want to expand the question of what you find interesting to work with, please go ahead.
No, sure. No, I'm happy to talk about that. I guess with known effects of lightning on the body, which is I guess we'll see documentation or footage of it, but it's a low-lit room. The walls are all painted a kind of a deep red, a sort of brick or like oxblood red. It's actually the name of the color is smoldering in the paint catalog. And it's a dimly lit room. There's one light bulb, a sort of half-mirrored, half-chromed light bulb hanging from the ceiling via copper pipe, and some low bench seating in the room. And the benches are positioned around, almost like a campfire, a small projection onto a piece of copper in the middle of the room. And the projection shows a match, and the match just sort of stands in the middle of the projection. It gets lit with another match that enters from off camera, and we hear the other match being struck but we don't see it being struck. It's the trace of it having been struck exists as sound, and then exists as in the fact that it's on fire when it enters the frame. So by being brought into proximity with the other match head, it ignites the match head. The match that's standing burns down, and it bows as it burns. It surrenders. It gives in. Let's say the chemical change, the chemical reaction that takes place in the match head, and we talk about matches anthropomorphically that way. We talk about them as having heads. The match head undergoes a chemical transformation, and then that transformation sort of pulls itself down through the rest of the match's body, let's say. And then once the match extinguishes, once it reaches the end of its process of burning, it fades off the screen and is replaced with another match that's standing ready to be burned. And there are enough matches in the cycle that you'll never see it repeated, or at least not in a way that you can be conscious of or certain of. So each of those burnings starts with a kind of let's say a flashpoint where the ignition happens, and then it becomes this process of unfolding, or of let's say disintegration, maybe, burning out, exhaustion. The matches give off a kind of final gasp of smoke when the flame is finally extinguished, that just sort of evaporates into the air. And I guess for me the point of thinking about the terminus in relationship to that work is not in a directly symbolist way, or I think it borders on the allegorical, but ultimately it's a question of what is your contemplative state. What's a contemplative state that can be brought about by all of these ingredients coexisting in a space? How can a space provide room for you to reflect on your own mortality, or to reflect on processes of grief or loss, or I mean, I'm just thinking about it now in this sense, but it's sort of like peekaboo. It's sort of like that game of peekaboo that Freud describes, where you have to see your parent vanishing and reappearing as an infant, so that you become comfortable with the idea that it disappears and comes back and disappears and comes back, and that's okay. To not be disturbed by that as a loss.
I believe you're interested in Eastern philosophy, Lee, and the near allegorical description you've given seems somehow to invite that. But there's another statement of yours, please pardon me if I keep talking back to your own statements, but they seem fascinating. And this one really is about the processes involved in your practice, as in our processes of making a work. And the quotation that I quite like, and it does seem to have resonance of Eastern philosophy, perhaps.
Okay.
I stumble, I grope, until something reveals the mortal banality of its associations. Mortal banality, a simple match.
Right.
Do you want to speak to that a little bit? To the processes, not necessarily to your quote, but
to the processes as in the process of the making work,
how you approach making a work.
Okay.
I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the case of Known Effects of Lightning on the Body, it grew from an observation that I had made when holding a match that was burning, that its body curled, that it bowed. And the fact that the match head becomes even more visible as a skull at the end of a spine when that shift happens, as the the stick of the match sort of contorts a little bit under the flame. So it grew from there in sort of thinking about, in regarding that with fascination, let's say. And I guess it goes back to what I was saying before about taking something kind of to its conclusion and exploding it out for as something worth spending attention on.
Mm-hmm. You seem to describe the simple act of looking closely and
Sure.
understanding how that actually has philosophical resonance, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
Would that be some way of describing it?
That sounds fair. That sounds fair to me.
There's another quote, and it's the final one, so you can relax after this. And it has to do a little bit with my curiosity about the interplay between material and idea in artworks.
Okay.
This is a huge subject when it stumbles into such terms as conceptual art or
Right.
whatever. And of course the current interest in materiality or immateriality even.
Mm-hmm.
But in any case, you've mentioned that making an artwork is every bit as absurd, direct, and fruitful as rearranging furniture just to see the pattern on the floor. What a delightful statement.
Thank you. You have to take me not so seriously, maybe. But sorry, go on.
So I'm kind of curious, if that's an intro, to how you see this interplay between idea and material. I guess it can be theorized or it can be personalized.
Mm-hmm.
Any comments?
I mean, I suppose to elaborate on what I was saying before about the hesitation that I have around kind of prescribed symbolism. I think it comes from the desire to allow someone to come to their own realizations, but a kind of manipulated set of realizations, let's say. So an outlining of a path that then a person ends up following, or sometimes, I mean, ideally, not even necessarily while they're in front of the work itself. I think I like that idea that that an artwork can by means of deception or aesthetics or material seduction kind of lull you into thinking about it one way while you're standing in front of it, only to reveal itself in a different way. Not an opposite way, but let's say a subversive way further down the road, if that makes sense.
Art history. We all seem embedded in it. Do you have a fascination or interest in the history of art as a practice or as a discourse? And I guess as an obvious instance of that, the work of other artists, whether alive or dead. Because the question of how artists interplay with one another is also of interest. Any thoughts on that for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, and drawing it back into a question of aesthetics, I suppose I don't find myself looking to contemporary art for aesthetic power as much as for the power of the idea, or the way that an idea can unfold, or the way that an idea can be couched or reframed. And find myself looking more to art history for examples of aesthetic power. It's an interesting question. Because we can't ever really separate ourselves from our own context or our own time anyway, but
Well, maybe that's a question. And what is our own time? Another building on art history, I guess, or on the work of other artists as we look around as artists ourselves, there is the tendency to want, maybe it's a false one, but a tendency to want to figure out what is the overall discourse here, what is the context in which they're operating in, which I presumably am operating in, but
Right.
how to articulate that. So I guess what is it's sometimes described as the dominant discourse, or the discourse that seems to be threading through many people's practices.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any thoughts on that for today, the current discourse?
Yeah.
If you don't, we can go
Well,
on.
no, I do. I have lots of thoughts on it. I have no conclusions about it, but I have
Who
lots of
does?
thoughts on it. I don't know. I mean, it depends on what one means by the time, and is it this year or this epoch? Is it? It depends what one means by sort of by locating one's practice. Is it geographically? Is it in a sort of pan-global online community? Is it by age bracket, or by sort of the kind of three-tiered emerging mid-senior groupings? Is it yeah, I don't. So I mean, one's time is sort of up for grabs in that respect. I was talking to Michelle Jakes about Toronto art and Canadian art, and what is the thing that can or should be celebrated about Canadian art, and we were positing that it's intellectualism, that it's a kind of familiarity with and proximity to academic theory and critical theory, and a kind of, I mean, the specific example we were talking about was McLuhan, and this affinity that people have had for his theories of media, both in pop culture, but then also people who work with those media themselves. So I don't know. I mean, that sort of starts to nudge us towards some sort of a geographic or nationalistic sense of what this time is. I don't know. I mean, nobody ever really knows while they're in the middle of it, right? Because it's the question of what's water to a fish, that kind of thing. But
What is trend to an artist?
yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so of course, I don't necessarily want to demolish the idea of the context in which we practice to simple trending, although trending seems to be on everybody's lips, I suppose. Maybe it always has been.
Well,
but in your own practice, or how you situate your own practice, Lee, trends or not, is there a context that you establish for yourself that you see as consistent with the culture around you that you could speak to?
I mean, I guess it's consistent that I borrow from pop culture. It's not omnipresent, but it's pretty consistent. It's consistent that I'm reluctant to rely on a single medium, or a single, not even medium, but discipline. I don't know, I guess I feel like it's pretty rare that painting is enough or photography is enough. And enough is like enough to what end? Well, the end of complexity and that mix of like signification and embodiment, I suppose.
You quoted Zizek just a moment ago, and I'm not sure if Zizek is now just a trend, but he does seem to have important things to say about our contemporary culture. And in quoting him, or misquoting him, dequoting him or something, could I imagine that to be, in some respects, an empathy for the positions he takes?
It's an empathy for some positions that he takes, I suppose. I mean, in a certain respect, I feel sometimes like, let's say, greater or more consistent philosophical compatibility with comics than I do with professional paid thinkers, but
I'm sure Wittgenstein would appreciate that.
I like Wittgenstein too. He's pretty funny though. Zizek is funny.
And maybe that brings us back to comedy.
Sure.
You mentioned comedy. Do you want to talk a little bit further about how you see that operating in your own work?
Sure. I've described it before as the work is all about death, but it's funny the way King Lear is funny, and I'm not being cheeky. I really think King Lear is hilarious. It's really funny.
You'll have to follow that along for me.
Sure. It's. I mean, this is the absurd, and it's absurdly funny because it's absurd to think that you can fully and completely plan for your own death. That you can set in motion all of these plans of authorship or of control, or authority that will persist in a clean way, that will unfold the way you had intended, the way you'd envisioned, or the way they had in your sort of perfectly tactical brain. Because you throw other people into the mix. You throw expectation or birthright in the case of King Lear, or jealousy or admiration or grief into that mix, and it unravels. So I think that King Lear is about this this guy trying to plan for his own non-being and failing utterly to do so in any effective or useful way, and I just think that's really funny.
And that runs through your work.
Yeah, I think so. In some ways as a kind of alternative, in suggesting, well, what if you don't plan for it? What if you don't spend that time worrying about it, or that energy in sort of consternation and anxiety around it? That's one of the ways that manifests. Another way is a kind of, let's say, destabilizing of death and humor as oppositional, or death and life as oppositional. So I'm thinking about a project that I did last year called Palliative Care, 1985 to 1992, which is a video compilation. It's a supercut of every reference to death from the Golden Girls. So and it's about 25 minutes long, and it's pretty solid of just death, dies, funeral, dying, morbid, death, dismemberment, dies, dying, and they just sort of rattle it off. But if the word death or the death reference came at the end of a sentence and it was at the end of a punchline where there's a laugh track, I've preserved the laugh track. And actually the most unsettling moments, I think, in that timeline are the laugh tracks. It's not when they're talking about death and dismemberment, it's when everything goes hang and then you have this artificial sort of insistence on laughter, on a kind of forced laughter.
Lee, your students must love you, and you do teach, and you continue to teach, despite all the problems that are surrounding teaching today at universities. You have become very well regarded as a teacher, and I understand that you enjoy the process of teaching. Do you want to talk a little bit about that for yourself?
Sure. I mean, you had mentioned Eastern philosophy before, and I suppose that as a fascination has influenced the way I approach art teaching as well. And I don't know how true this really is, but if if you approach a Zen master and say, I want to study with you, I want to study at your temple, then you're expected, they'll say no, they'll reject you. And you're expected to then sort of sit on the steps of the temple night and day until they eventually let you in. And it's kind of mind gamey, and it's a little bit, I mean, it's almost cartoonish in a way. Like, I think that's one of the scenes that plays out in Kung Fu in the David Carradine show, is that he as a child had to wait at the steps of the temple. So it's sort of sensationalized, but there's something in there about, unless you have a great doubt, or unless you have a profound curiosity that you can't manage to slake on your own, then there's really nothing I can do for you. So I tell my students that too, that if you're not curious, if there's not something that really drives you to think about, or to know about, or to find out more of, then I can't do anything for you.
Do you make them wait outside the door?
No, I should. That's a good idea. I should. I don't think you're allowed to do that. No, although there is I suppose there's a kind of intellectual waiting outside the door where I don't know what to tell you, or to give you as things to look at, or things to consider, or ideas to wonder about, unless there is some sort of kernel of compulsive curiosity to go from.
And when or if they express that,
Uh-huh.
is that the point where the whole process becomes interesting for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And express it doesn't have to mean that they come to it explicitly and fully formed, or that they can articulate it perfectly. It never happens that way. I don't think any of us can actually articulate our great curiosity perfectly, because if we would, maybe we would just quit. But it comes in other ways. It becomes visible in other ways. It becomes visible by things that they make without knowing why they're making them. It becomes visible through ways that they address their work, or ways that they address the work of others, that are meandering, or off topic, or accidental, that sort of give you the clues as to what it is that they're really interested in figuring out.
We talked about what a contemporary discourse might be, or how one would approach that question.
Uh-huh.
But lurking behind that is the question of the art system. And the art system, of course, employs the galleries, the critics, the curators, artists even. And it seems to have a institutional relationship all of its own.
Mm-hmm.
And many people don't quite understand what that is, and that would include, I think, a lot of artists.
Sure.
Lost in the art system, maybe. How do you feel about this system for yourself, and how you experienced it?
I don't know. I mean, anytime I encounter the term art world, my gut reaction is, well, which one? Which art world? So system is maybe, that response is a little bit out of place, but not entirely. So which art system? Are we talking about commercial galleries, which operate in quite a different way from artist-run centers? Are we talking about public galleries, which operate differently from sort of DIY spaces? Or are we talking about system to mean the way that art gets circulated, and the way that people encounter, like most of the artworks that people encounter, they encounter indirectly because they encounter them online, or
Magazines.
Magazines, I think probably more online now, and I remember we used to complain about the fact that art circulated through magazines where there would be a couple images and some textual write-up or a blurb.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious where, if the people who were upset about that are more upset or less upset about Instagram as like where it's just one image, not really any commentary, not really any exposition around the artwork. Yeah, I mean that's also a system, that system of circulation and dissemination.
So there are many systems within the system, you might say.
Sure, within or verging on it, like a kind of Venn diagram, sort of multi-orbed Venn diagram.
Where would you situate yourself? That's a hard question.
Yeah, I guess if you only get to pick one, it's a hard question. If you can cobble together a series of situations that or systems that you are free to interface with and then abandon, then it's a lot easier to situate yourself, I think. But that's also, given the nature of my practice, I don't see myself as a specialist or someone who's interested in virtuosity with a particular medium. I wonder if it's harder for artists who have those kinds of practices to figure out the constellation of systems of which they want to be a part, simply because the variable of how they work is more of a control.
Let me put it to you this way then. You have a gallery, represents you. You are about to embark on a residency in Scotland, and you write. So it would seem to me that you have developed, again, thinking of what you're just saying, a number of approaches to various systems within the art system.
Right.
And I guess my obvious question then is, how does that work for you?
Fine. It works fine.
Ask a question, get an answer.
Yeah, I suppose. I don't know. But I guess it's because of what I was saying before about sort of having feet in all pools simultaneously, or having that kind of disciplinarily nomadic practice. I also think that, I mean, we were talking about the present and one's inability to define the present or to lock down one's own time in any meaningful, descriptive way or definitive way. And I'm thinking again about Marshall McLuhan and Marshall McLuhan's idea that the artist is the one that sees the present and has to find ways of making the present intelligible to other people. We can maybe undermine that argument, because if the artists can't even define their own present, well then what good are they at large? But I think in a certain way that sense of piecing together your own constellation of modes of working and of contexts in which to present, and of communities into which you want to belong or that you want to interface with, that is the present. The idea that you have a single institutional path that's fixed, or that's exclusive, or that's thoroughly systematized, that has clear instructions and clear expectations. That, I don't know if that ever existed, but it certainly doesn't exist now. And yeah, so I suppose in a roundabout way I've sort of answered that question of like what the present moment is it is that cobbling together. That we see that in labor as well, where everyone has to become a freelancer. The gig economy is our moment, or is at the very least on the horizon. So yeah, I suppose it's the same kind of thing. It's just that maybe artists are more accustomed to that, or contemporary artists. Anyway, I don't know.
Is the public, so an obvious question that arises once one has looked at or thought about the the system, the art system, is the public for this, and public for yourself, of course, your own work. Do you have any thoughts about the relationship? What you sketched out is a multivalent approach to your practices. And I guess that must mean that there's a multifaceted audience. Is that how you see it? Or is there an audience that you most specifically want to target, or that you feel energized by?
I don't really spend any time thinking about audience. I spend more of my time thinking about a viewer, and those sound like a very hair-splitting differentiation, but I think there's something crucially different about them. In thinking about an audience, you're thinking about groups of people. You're thinking about the way people with an already defining set of characteristics are likely to encounter the work. So, and I think it's a term that we probably borrow. I mean, we borrow it from theater, but we also kind of borrow it from advertising and branding. What's the audience? What's the target market? That kind of thing. I'm more interested in the viewer and not in what kind of a viewer I can get, but in what kind of an experience the viewer can have. And I mean, reader response theory, et cetera, like I'm fully aware that people come in with their own stuff, and the stuff that they come in with depends on who they are and sort of, and their experiences and their allegiances or affiliations. But those also, as a kind of unpredictable factor, then in some sense can't become a governing set of predictions on which to build a work. So yeah, I mean, in a way we're always making work for ourselves anyway, and I don't mean that in the sense of like art as therapy. We're making it purely to expunge our own garbage, but I mean it more in that we're the first audience member, let's say, for our own work. We're our own first viewer. We're the lens through which all of those sort of systems of self-critique that happen in the studio get filtered. So
one filter, of course, is the critic and criticism as a discourse. And I just mentioned that you write about art. I'm always interested in what would be the premises that would motivate or underwrite writing itself. Have you assembled an idea for yourself, Lee, about where you come from as an art critic when you write criticism?
Not consciously, although I've thought about it a couple times as we've been speaking, because I'm realizing that ways that I talk about my own work are often arrived at tangentially from a way that I've spoken about somebody else's work or written about someone else's work. So early on I said that I'm not particularly interested in absurdity, and then had to walk that back later when I realized, no, actually I am interested in absurdity. And I've written about absurdity in that kind of existential Sisyphean level of absurdity in John Sazaki's work, for instance. It's not something that I necessarily would have thought about enough to use as a framing device for my own work without having spent the time with somebody else's work who was clearly working with absurdity as a theme, or thinking about ghosts and haunting and what ghosts mean for how memory works. I was writing about Rebecca Miller's work at Stride a few years ago, and again, ghosts are not something I necessarily would have thought of or arrived at in relationship to my own work, without having done that and spent the time sort of thinking about it. So I suppose in that sense I use writing very selfishly to to work as a kind of incubator for modes of discourse around my own practice as well as for other people's. I don't know, I think I'm interested in it as a conversation device too, as a kind of I ask my students a lot, like, what kinds of conversations do you want to grow out of this work? If you don't want to define your ideal viewer, or you don't want to define a set of objectives or a set of takeaways, what kinds of things do you expect people to talk about once they've encountered this work? What sort of conversations grow from it? So I guess criticism in that respect is I hope, a kind of long form conversation where, and by long form I don't even necessarily mean the length of the essay, I mean the time scale at which the conversation unfolds. It's not, a morning. It's a much longer period of time that happens, and it's a more public forum of conversation too. So
I like that point. There's a couple more things I'd like to address, and one of them is the collector. And how do you feel about the notion of collecting, I guess, against the background of the systems we've been discussing, and of course with respect to how you see yourself as an artist whose work is, like all artists, collectible. And the collector comes in many forms, so not just the private collector, but also the public collection, and so on and so forth. Do you have any thoughts about the issue of collecting with respect to the various aspects of how we practice in the world?
Sure. Because I went to school in Western Canada, and because I went to school in the late 90s, there wasn't really the sense that you would be able to sell work if you were making video or performance or installation. Not if you stayed in Canada. You would have to go to Europe, maybe Asia. But I think that's changed over time. I think the way that we handle systems of collecting and what is the thing, heavy air quotes, what is the thing that's being collected. So that's sort of opened up and broadened at the same time that I've also, in that kind of disciplinarily nomadic practice I was mentioning before, have found myself sometimes making objects. So it's not something that I was trained to think about, because it just was completely off the radar when I was in school. It just wasn't even a consideration, because it didn't seem like a possibility. The emphasis was placed, and I would actually love to see this happen more in Toronto, but the emphasis was placed on artist-run centers. And that if you're going to be making video art and installation and performance, or anything that even sits at all outside of, paintings of grain elevators, it was Calgary, then artist-run centers are how you're going to find venues. They're how you're going to sustain a practice. So that's where I'm coming from. So having commercial representation is pretty new for me. That said, I'm in the fortunate position of having representation with somebody who understands, let's say, I'm going to put this, who understands that artists are going to do weird stuff, that art's value, and we can mean that monetarily, we can also mean that sort of socioculturally, that art's value is liquid and is multifaceted and depends on its ability to provide experiences as well as objects. So yeah, the space of the commercial gallerist and not in all cases, probably not in the majority of cases, but the space of the commercial gallerist is in the process of becoming kind of hybrid project and object space, I think. Maybe that's a blip. I kind of don't think so, given how art works and how our economies are becoming information economies and intellectual property economies rather than material economies. But yeah, I mean, Paul Mason gives capitalism 50 years at the outside anyway, so we'll see.
Grain elevators. Now they seem real, and I can understand
They seem
why.
real.
They seem real,
Yeah.
and I can understand why people would want a painting of a grain elevator, maybe in Calgary particularly, but
Sure.
I suspect everywhere, something of that nature. And what you're describing, it seems to me, is a new, because the grain elevator seems authentic. It seems
Right.
it seems heavily, solidly in place.
Uh-huh.
It is the world, as it were. You pass it every day, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to ground one.
Mm-hmm.
And I know there's anxiety over the loss of those grain elevators.
Sure.
So we're talking here about something real, about something that, in some respect, if it's grounding, it's authentic. It has an air of authenticity about it, even if the painting of the grain elevator itself is inauthentic, if it's really trite, perhaps. But nonetheless, there's this search for, or sense that somehow one has to be able to touch something to hold on to it.
Mm-hmm.
What you're describing, it would seem to be a new kind of authenticity, a new kind of grounding, something that is much more fluid, obviously, than a grain elevator, but nonetheless, ultimately grounding in the same sense. Would you see it that way? Would you see that as in a way, a kind of new authenticity in terms of how we ground ourselves?
I suppose I don't know how new it is. If it's a dematerialization or if it's let's say a rematerialization into semi-material things like light and information. I'm not sure it's that much of a shift. It's a subtle adjustment maybe, because the things that you're talking about with the sort of the way that a painting of a grain elevator is valued, those are abstract values. Those are it seems authentic, but that is an oxymoron. It's right. Its authenticity is a veneer, so therefore it's not authenticity. And I think the reason that people appreciate paintings of grain elevators or like paintings of grain elevators is not actually because of anything material. It's because of sets of ideas or data, even, or affective responses to belonging, regional identity, nostalgia, like all of these sort of like layers of sentiment. And we kind of malign sentiment, but that's where all this stuff comes from. And the things that we've been talking about, the panic around death. I mean, that's another way of talking about sentiment. That sort of apprehensive fear. So maybe I should just start making paintings of grain elevators. That might actually be a more direct route.
Well, it seemed to be well within the realm of the finality of death.
Yes. Yeah, it's true. And that sort of Le Corbusier, like modernist, fist raised against the horizon kind of gesture as well. The raised middle finger towards death, maybe.